Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 24th of October. I'm Robert Barwick, and joining me today is a very special guest, Dr. Wilson Tsai. Welcome, Wilson.
Hello.
Okay, in this episode of the CEC Report, I'm going to interview Wilson, who's an APRA whistleblower, and the subject we're going to discuss is Australia's banks are in crisis because regulation is a sham. Now, before we get into that, a couple of things. The Royal Commission deadline is this Friday, 5 p.m. Wilson, I got a submission to put in. I think you got a submission to put in. Lots of people have been making submissions. By the time you watch this show, the deadline will have already been passed. So I'm not appealing for more submissions. If the deadline's passed, that's it. I just want to make the point that I found out today the Reserve Bank has put in some kind of submission apparently, and the submission amounts to pressure on the Commissioner, giving him the message that he probably shouldn't do anything that would slow the credit in the economy. Now, this is quite big pressure for the Royal Commissioner, right? He's the powers that be, the vested interest in the status quo, they're very clear. They do not want structural separation, etc. And he has to weigh that up, that pressure from them, against the pressure he's going to feel from the public in the form of the submissions that lots and lots of you have put in, right? So it was a very important exercise to do that. The other thing is this week there was an apology by the government on the institutional child abuse issue, which arose out of a Royal Commission. That was a very big Royal Commission. One of the points discussed as a result of that is a lot of the recommendations of that Royal Commission have not been implemented. And that's just something very important to remember. We can't let this Royal Commission process let the politicians off the hook, right? We have to engage with the Royal Commission, that's great, but whether he recommends structural separation or not, it'll be great if he does, but even if he does, there's no guarantee the politicians will abide by it, right? So that effort to keep the pressure on the politicians is very important. Which brings me to my second point on this. We had the Wentworth by-election on Saturday. The Liberals have effectively lost. It's not quite formalised yet. There's now a sixth independent in the House of Representatives, which means they hold the balance of power. And that is great because 4 of those 6 independents are, or minor party people, crossbenchers, are openly in favour of banking separation. The 5th one probably is, and we don't know the new Member of Parliament yet. So what we're going to be encouraging people to do is start contacting all those independents so they feel positive pressure from the public so that they use their position to make sure the government and the opposition do not get away with either using delaying tactics of the Royal Commission or ignoring the Royal Commission when the reports are handed down, etc. That banking separation is put on the table in Australia, right? So we'll put out more details on that. I just wanted to make that point before we get started. All right, let's now talk with Dr. Wilson Tsai about how Australia's banks are in crisis because regulation is a sham. So, like I said, welcome, Wilson. Before we begin, let's talk about you briefly, your background. And I like this story. You're an astrophysicist, and the very first time Wilson and I spoke, I made one of those throwaway lines about financial reform. I said, Wilson, look, the solutions are not rocket science. And he said, well, as it happens, I am a rocket scientist. And that's true. So Wilson was an astrophysicist. You were at ANU, I believe. How did you end up in finance?
Well, I was in a project to get funding to get one of the first supercomputers for Australian universities. And we come up with all these roadblocks about the relevance of it for the economy. In the mid-80s, there was a lot of talk about Australia being a clever country, sunrise industry, and so on. So in order to talk to the economists and so on, I took courses in economics, and largely to actually pitch my arguments for why we need a supercomputer in Australia. So
you learned economics to justify why we needed scientific research.
That's right. And from there, I went to Sydney. I taught mathematics and applied mathematics and finance and economics. And one day I was contacted by so-called headhunters because Bankers Trust and Macquarie Bank were looking for people for foreign exchange dealing and funds management. So eventually I got a job with BT.
So this is the deregulation era of the financial system. This is the onset of things like derivatives, and you have advanced mathematical skills. So you're what they would call now a quant, right? And you're the type of person they poached from real science and real engineering, etc., to be able to use the mathematical skills to design their products.
As you said, some of the people call us rocket scientists of Wall Street.
Yeah, that's right.
And so our skills were obviously in things like computing, mathematical modeling, and option pricing, derivatives, research, and so on. And after the several years in the industry, I was not very happy with a lot of scandals that were already starting to appear. There was all this Orange County in the United States. There is these are the big derivatives losses that were starting to erupt around the world. And Gibson's greeting, and I was expecting that this industry would be folded up pretty quickly,
right?
But not to be, in fact. And so eventually I joined the regulators because I couldn't understand why all these things were allowed to happen. And so I spent 3 years with ASIC, and then 5 years with APRA, and then 1 year with the Australian Treasury with the Superannuation System Review in 2009. And
I want to, so in this period, especially when you were with APRA, this coincided with the global financial crisis in 2008. And you and I have talked about this a lot. But when that happened, what I find fascinating about you thought as a scientist, not as an economist. And what did you conclude from the global financial crisis as a scientist?
Well, I learned all these theories, and I assumed they were true. I mean, all this economic theory they teach you at university, and all this mathematical modeling, option pricing, I thought they were science, so much mathematics. But when the global financial crisis hit, I realized that all these formulas, all these things, they were completely wrong, because it couldn't have happened. The global financial crisis could not have happened if everything was correct, and risk management is in fact a science. Risk management turns out not to be a science. And the whole thing was basically to give an aura of respectability to that industry. And that's why I get very anxious about the huge amount of derivatives now floating around in the world. And in fact, I think they have great, because the regulators do not understand derivatives, and they don't know much about it, that I believe that must be a lot of, a can of worms in those things. And we will see eventually, because these things can't go on indefinitely. Already we have trillions and trillions of dollars worth of these things, and at some stage, they will blow up.
Well, you've heard it there, folks. Not just from the CEC, but from someone who was with the regulator and has the advanced mathematical skills to understand derivatives, and he's very nervous about them. And so when the government authorities and the regulators profess this lack of concern, don't believe them, understand from what Wilson's saying, they're not qualified to be concerned or unconcerned, actually. Let's take a quick break. Before we go, I just want to make the point that since you've been retired, you've been analysing the financial system. In a sense, you've been trying to intervene with your concerns. That's how Wilson came into contact with us. We both made submissions to the 2014 Financial System Inquiry. And in that submission, actually, in 2014. You advocated GlassSteagall then, and then of course we met when you sent a message in support of our campaign against bail-in last year. And since then, Wilson has been doing an almighty amount of work for the cause of GlassSteagall. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of what's wrong with regulation in Australia. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where I'm having a discussion with APRA whistleblower Dr. Wilson Tsai on Australia's banks are in crisis because regulation is a sham. Now let's talk about this regulation issue in some detail, Wilson, but I want to make the point, because Wilson is a whistleblower, he has things he reveals to the appropriate authorities about the inner workings of APRA and its failings. But due to APRA's secrecy laws, he can't talk openly about that. So we can't talk about that on this show. It's the kind of thing someone like Wilson should be called before the Royal Commission to discuss that, etc. So he has the appropriate protections. But what we're going to talk about is more general, right? And the general observations that will be shocking anyway about regulation and how it operates in Australia. Now, the first question, Wilson, which comes from, again, our discussions, is your experience with the regulators, the GFC, you have real insight into this question of regulation. What, in your view, has been the ideology of regulation?
Well, everyone been taught at university economic courses about the market, free market, and so on. I think very few people realise, including me, until many years afterwards, that regulation, the way it's conceived in the early 80s, was actually a disbelief in regulation. In other words, the fundamental assumption was that regulations was unnecessary.
And right there, that's shocking, but go on.
And what's more, consumers do not need to be protected. Now, the rationale for this is that the assumption is the market is efficient and consumers or investors are well informed, right? So if consumers are well informed, then all the decisions are made rationally to improve their own welfare. You know, the self-interest is at play. And that's why occasionally you hear the regulator say caveat emptor, right? Which means that buyers beware.
Let the buyer beware.
Right?
You're on your own.
And that's why they, if you look at APRA's key performance indicators, this is a management jargon for measuring your own performance.
How you were supposed to perform while you were there, yeah.
Well, the organisation itself had this KPIs, and if you look at it, none of those KPIs relates to consumers. They all relate to the institutions, the industry, and so on. So, and even with ASIC, which is a bit more consumer-oriented, ASIC's focus is on corporations. There's a corporations law, right? And so these two regulators are actually not there to protect the average person, right? It may sound a bit far-fetched.
Well, but the experience of the Royal Commission has played out exactly what you've just said is what's been on display at the Royal Commission.
Yeah.
They haven't been protected by the regulators.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of regulations are merely to harmonise, particularly in APRA, the operations of the industry. So this idea of self-regulation is that the industry gets together and decides on the rules that they want to abide by. And APRA is effectively an organiser of the industry. Well,
and just explain the funding decisions, like you've described this to me, how APRA decides how much money, because it's funded by the banks it regulates.
Yep.
And it's got to decide how much money it changes a year. So what you just said relates to that, right? They base how much they charge the banks on what the banks agree to be regulated.
Now the APRA, for example, is funded by the industry. Through a levy system, the levies are proportional to the size of the institution, and annually the Australian Treasury negotiates with the banks how much funding APRA needs, and so really, and the way that the funding is decided is based upon projects and ongoing activities. So if APRA wants to do something new, they would have to approach the banks for permission to do whatever is new, because he who pays the piper calls the tune, right?
So the so-called cop on the beat gets the permission first for the people he's policing.
Well, virtually, although not exactly. And the government call this the cost recovery approach to regulation. So all this is consistent with the idea of self-regulation. And
so when there's failings, like I said at the Royal Commission, but also there's this observation that we have these four main regulators and things fall between the cracks. Your argument is effectively that's intentional. The structure of regulation, the divided structure of regulation, it reflects this ideology of really no regulation.
Yes, one of the statements in the Campbell Report in 1981 was that they believe that the regulation should be such that the government cannot interfere. So there should be minimal regulation, and what this means is a sort of a form of self-regulation, and minimum government interference. And so therefore they developed this structure where they split up all the different regulators so that they can't do everything. I mean, in other words, they've got to be very well coordinated to be able to do anything substantial.
And you know from working there, they don't coordinate very well at all.
No, they have regular meetings through a umbrella institution called the Council of Financial Regulators. So on a day-to-day basis, there is absolutely no coordination whatsoever.
You were one of the people. Obviously, there's plenty of people who work at these regulators who are well-intentioned and do their job. You were one of them. You did your analysis. You put out your reports. Without giving details, what was your experience when you put out a report that was inconvenient for the banks?
Well, firstly, I was shut up and being sort of shunted because I dared to speak without going through the media. They spend more money on managing the media than they do on research. And
then when you left, what did they do to the research department?
Yeah, well, a couple of years after I left, they closed down the research unit on the basis of delivering an efficiency dividend.
So the APRA announces its job is financial stability. That's its responsibility. It's protecting us from a financial crisis, folks, but it doesn't have a research department that can do the research to see if a crisis may be coming. This is a joke. Wilson, let's take another break. When we come back, we'll talk about GlassSteagall specifically. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're talking with Dr. Wilson Tsai about banking regulation in Australia. So, finally, Wilson, let's discuss the real reason we're here, to get GlassSteagall banking separation in Australia. The CEC has been fighting for GlassSteagall since 2009. You independently came to the view that GlassSteagall was necessary. Why do you think it's necessary? How do you think it will help?
Well, basically, the oligopoly of the major banks means that there's a lot of concentration in various types of financial services, right? From financial advice, stockbroking, insurance, and so on. The big bank uses this integration to hide a lot of cost. You know, they pass business from one unit to the other, and therefore it reduces competition in any sector in which they're involved in. So if you look at the data, I mean, the major banks account for maybe about 80% or 90% of the whole financial service industry, right? And in the case of superannuation, for example, the bank is able to extract a lot of cost through this integration structure.
And it's not even through the declared fees. There's lots of hidden ways, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. And the argument that they present, for doing what they do is that, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how we do the investing. All the consumer or the investor should care about is what they get in their hands, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the argument for not being transparent with all the costs and fees. And the other very important reason for GlassSteagall is that all these derivatives, a lot of them are given priority. In other words, because if the Australian banks hold some of these derivatives and some of it goes sour, there could be repercussion, right, for the rest of the world through all this international trading. And the Bank for International Settlement is anxious that this doesn't create what is known as the contagion. Mm. And so they put high priorities on saving these derivatives. So if the banks lost money, they have to get money from somewhere to cover up for the derivatives. In other words, the rest of the banking system effectively becomes collateral for the derivatives.
And that's the danger of bail-in.
Precisely. So the bail-in provision provides the legal power for APRA to arrange this to happen. So that's why it is. That's why GlassSteagall is necessary, because all these innovative financial engineering derivatives products should be separated from normal, day-to-day workings of the economy, which is through the traditional commercial banking system.
Now, Wilson, you've spent your career in academia, banking and regulators. For the last 12 months or most of this year, you've been having fun with me in Canberra, talking to politicians on GlassSteagall. Just briefly, how have you found that experience?
Well, my view is that the politicians are really clueless about what's going on. I think partly because the regulators have been able to keep everyone in the dark, including most people, right? And also the politicians. So it is a very dangerous thing that such important things are not even understood by people in charge.
And that's why the process, and as you've seen yourself, the process that we're involved in of getting the public to bring it to the politicians' attention, even if you don't feel qualified, they don't know anyway, right? You bring it to their attention, and then we've benefited from that in our meetings, right? Wilson, thank you very much for coming and joining us today. This has been great, very enlightening. We never have enough time, but that's good. We'll put your website up on the screen that people can look at your more detailed stuff. But thanks for joining us, and thanks for tuning into the CEC Report.